Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Now, we are often told there are two sides of entrepreneurship. One, which is all about shiny suits, boardrooms, big money, and fast growth, which we hear so much about. But then there's another side, which is the reality for most of us. And I'm talking about places, I'm talking about context where institutions don't work, where war and displacement they shape daily lives. And that's where entrepreneurship isn't about opportunity, it's about survival. My guest today knows this reality better than most. Professor Theodore Khoury is professor of management and strategy at Portland State University. He's one of the leading international voices on entrepreneurship in fragile and conflict affected contexts. His research features in top journals like Organization Science, Journal of Business Venturing, and Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, which goes far beyond the usual startup stories. It looks at how institutions, social norms, and power structures they shape enterprise when the ground beneath entrepreneurs is anything but stable. And his work pushes us to see entrepreneurship not just as a luxury, but as a survival, resilience, and even social transformation. So, from masculinities in war zones to supply network in refugee camps, his work has forced us all to rethink not only how entrepreneurs act, but the world within which they act. Ted, welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm so grateful you're here.
It's so good to be here, Tabish. It's really good. I love what this podcast is doing, so it's an honor to join you today.
Thank you. Now, before we get into your work, Ted, I want to start with something very raw and something which has been disturbing to both of us, as far as I know. And I won't let anyone tell me it's political, so as academics, we don't talk about it. So when I look at Palestine today, I don't see it just as another conflict or war. I see it as a mirror of who we are, the killing, the displacement, the humiliation, and now famine. It's not only about occupation, it's about the world you and me have helped build. A world that puts profit above people and power above justice. And again, like I said, some call it politics and stay silent. But while we brag about our intelligence, about our technology and prosperity, we have lost all the morals that should define us. So, Ted, against this backdrop, how do you think about entrepreneurship and institution when the very same system we celebrate as progress are the ones enabling these destruction and stripping people, our people, of dignity, whether in Palestine or any other fragile economies?
Um, I'm glad you began there, actually, Tabish. I mean, it's something based on our conversations. It's always on my mind, and I know it's always on the mind of allies like yourself. Well, for me, it's deeply embedded within like different layers of traumas and things like that. Everything from transgenerational trauma from my father being a refugee and a Nakba survivor from Jerusalem from 1948, and my mother's family being economic migrants who came in the 30s to the U.S. and end up being trapped in the U.S. and not being able to return. So it's wrapped in this tremendous history, which is marked by a great deal of loss of resources and loss of opportunities, and and so it's very quite personal to me. And then now with the existential trauma of seeing some version of yourself uh, go through the genocide, every minute that's there is it's just that much more compounded, like in my world. So it's always on my mind in someone who tries to subscribe to systems thinking in how I think about the world and how I think about my research and how I try to relate, for instance, my research questions. Nobody is free until Palestine is free, and that's something that is a statement that is put out there. And for those who are in the know, you really understand one, how it's all connected, directly connected. These are not indirect connections that exist there, but that the case of Palestine in the human rights tragedy and the violence that Palestinians have undergone for, over 100 years now, but most squarely in the past 77 years, is, speaks to how far injustice can go in this world and setting a precedent for injustice that's there. Now, early in my work, I've looked a lot at like legal institutions and how legal institutions matter around the world. And, you know, in that work, a lot of it was like around patent law, for instance. And my big question was, um, you know, when these patent laws or new laws, world laws get put out to the world, particularly the developing world, do good things happen to them? Do good things happen to them if they sign on to treaties and try to uphold these international laws that are prescribed by Western nations of the world that's there? And largely they don't. Largely they don't benefit from those. It's not like there's more FDI necessarily that comes into those countries. It's not that there's this surge of innovation that happens by being a part of these. It's usually a lot of institutions that are overwhelmed by not having a lack of resources to uphold the funding of institutions, like government, legal, political institutions that exist from the originators of these laws that are coming from the Western world. And bringing that back to Palestine, we have the complete disregard for international law. Frankly, there's been the complete disregard for international law for 77 years by just the allowing Palestine to get this far. And so we have these, which is forgotten with time for the average person. And now we have these situations like, France, for instance, claiming they're going to recognize Palestine and quote unquote, like respect international law at this point in time, not acknowledging that they've been disregarding international law for 77 years by not acknowledging Palestinian borders and their right to exist and the determination of Palestinian human rights and their people. And so we have these kind of token gestures and things like that that are try to symbolize that they still respect international law and institutions by doing something like this, even though they said nothing about what the borders of Palestine that they're acknowledging are, or what the rights of Palestinian people should be. And so these are very curious moments for me when I look at that, is because they're largely symbolic, largely empty, and I think just ultimately pathetic at face value of what we're seeing that's happening here.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The only good thing which has come out of it, I feel, obviously this has been going on for good 70 years, 80 years now. The only good thing which has come out is it has really exposed the shamelessness and the brazen way in which the institutions and large part of the institutions have been going on in terms of what their intent is. And and that is for all of us to see and all of us to analyze and judge. But again, the curious part of that is even now, the large part of the mobilization or large part of discussion narrative isn't actually addressing the core problems or the core questions which doesn't get discussed or which doesn't get spoken about, which is why you feel that they are carrying on with what they are doing day in day out.
Yeah. I mean, I ask myself every hour how far, like, this violence and decimation of a country, of a people, can go. If, like, what lengths does it need to go to, before these world powers, decide it's gone too far? That's there. Never in my, even with my most cynical assumptions of these countries and how they think and behave, would I ever have dreamt that it would have come this far and still ongoing daily? So the mask is off, indeed. And we know the disconnect between the people and their representatives within world governments. That's there. We understand that. Um, and so what do we do with that? What do we do with that? And for me, like, I've always known the mask is off in my upbringing, in the way that I was taught and things like that. Like, I always knew all these things, but now it's an easier conversation to have with the average stranger, that they realize that the mask is off. And so, it's what do we do with something like that? And for me, like, for instance, when there's my activism on my campus and things like that, to get to bring uh, to be a watchdog, to bring our administration on our campus to accountability, for our relationships, what we're doing for our campus community, particularly our students and things like that. That's one of my first questions that I ask is, first of all, there's no debate. There should be no debate on the respect of international law. Okay, that's something that shouldn't be debatable. And so that's where I begin, is, where do you stand on international law? Do you believe that it should be observed? And because starting the conversation from there, of where there should be some universal understanding that exists there, is very important. And because right now in the US, we have this situation of very anti-DEI initiatives and things like that that are happening, and we're seeing a complete acquiescence of campuses to whatever the federal administration is asking them to do, and seeing places like Harvard and Columbia and these universities just completely cave in their value systems that's there, with their giant endowments, all for their federal funding that's there. Um, you know, Seeing things like that, and then looking at the administration and saying, our administration saying, like, what are you going to do? Are you also going to cave? Are you also going to give in to these absurd demands of what's there? Um, and then hearing how, like, they want to push back here and there, and when they mention things like observing law and things like that in these administrations, then I say, okay, so let's talk about international law. Do you also observe international law? And if universities are not observing international law, and we are the source of intellectual thought and ideas that gets put out to the world, that's there, then that's a very scary place, I think, to be.
I cannot agree more with that. And you so rightly put universities at the center of it. Which brings me to a question I wanted to begin with in terms of your own journey, your own career, which has seen a transformation. A scholar in your own right, in terms of having those patents, more than 40 of them, I believe, and then becoming a leading one in entrepreneurship, especially in the fragile context, and your very strong association from Palestine. You spent more than a decade, I believe, in engineering and micro nanotechnology. So the question here is, coming down to you on a personal note, um, what made you change that, or what made you move from engineering and patents into studying entrepreneurship? Does that transformation, does that relationship comes into play here?
Oh, I don't know if the story is so romantic, but I think I grew up. My father was a professor. My father was an artist, and I wish, I'm sure he wished he could have just spent his days just painting. But he was a professor because that's how you pay the bills. That's how you survive. He came to this country at the age of 16 and put himself through school, put himself through his MFA, and was able to to have this career in a small kind of like rural college town in Michigan that was there. And so I was raised with like you could say these two logics, at least two logics, and that was like the mindset of like a refugee where everything could be taken away at any moment, and that resources are precious, and that you need to find these stabilities in life, at least financially. And then there's for Palestinians, like there's no history of transgenerational wealth like carrying down across generations that's there because everything was taken away. And so these ideas of like trying to begin in the latter part of the last century to begin that chain of like transgenerational wealth creation and obtaining resources, obtaining some level of societal power, that was there. It was like we had to be practical. We had to take care of ourselves. We were trained to like do those things. But at the same time, all the conversations that we were having in our house were art and politics. And that's all we talked about is art, culture, and politics. And so we were activists at young ages. I remember being front row, seeing Angela Davis speak, as a young child, and how, seeing her orate and seeing her inspiring crowds, things like that. That's the kind of world that my parents brought me to, and a deep appreciation for the arts. And so I'm an artist myself. I don't pay the bills that way, but I paint, I make music, I do things that is part of my DNA that fulfills that part of the legacy. But being an engineer was a way to pay the bills and survive. So I did it. I didn't love it. I went to a master's level in biomedical engineering, and then I ended up in semiconductor industry and nanotechnology. And I think it wasn't until it spent about 10 years in that, and my job was to invent, and so I did it and it made a lot of patents and things like that. I think on the outside that looks like interesting or intriguing. To me, it was just a job that was
Mhm.
there in that space, and I thought it was straightforward for where technology was at that point. And so, but it was a way to survive and be a good boy. That I was out there finding stability and things like that, like you know Palestinians haven't had, and then finding a way to kind of get back to those passions and interests and those conversations that we'd have in our house. And I think the most reasonable way, having done an MBA at that point, was to do it, just kind of studying organizations and things like that. And IB, international business, was the closest place to get into international questions at that time. And I remember being really discouraged by one professor who's like, stay away from international entrepreneurship. There's nothing there. It's so hard to get published. You got to be studying China or things like that. And like it was, I didn't listen to my advisors, and I'm really glad I didn't. And so and stay away from qualitative work. It's harder to get published. And I was given these advice, and like I had good training. I had a really good training, good advisors, no complaints about that. But here and there, these kind of practical guides that were not that different from a refugee scarcity mentality of like choose the safe route. Um, but I was just too intrigued by exploring these questions elsewhere. And I think everything I do, I can relate back to, you know, these places around the world are good things happening to them. And how do good things happen to them? And entrepreneurship is just one form of, it's just one vehicle maybe to get there. And being involved with development and working with NGOs and consulting in that space after my doctorate, like, and seeing firsthand what's not working in these places, I've been able to connect a lot of dots on the ground to really try and inform those questions. And that was really important to me, is to be able to speak to these research questions in a way. And that's where, like, a lot of the quantitative work at the country level I was doing early on, I was like, okay, yeah, the regression results look good, all that, and the paper's all tidied up and published or something. And I was like, I just need to know more. I need to make sure. I need to make sure I got this right. And so that being authentic to the questions you ask, and at least having the opportunity to explore them, like switching my methodologies kind of mid-career, and switching like my levels of analysis and things like that. These are conversations you and I have talked about, Tabish, and it's they're risky moves, and you're told not to do it and to stay in your lane and things like that. But they've led to the most exciting, I think, turns, and kind of kept it all fresh and interesting in the career. Yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to all of what you just mentioned, but I believe the seeds are already there in terms of the artistic background you had, inherited from your dad, and then you moving on and how you really applied. So I can see a few themes emerging here already, Ted, in terms of how you have, and this is good for us in terms of the discipline and all the other scholars who know you and who've read your work,
Mm.
but your background in innovation, at the same time that resilience within your family in terms of starting afresh, you think they've played a role, especially coming from a fragile context? They've played a role in you trying to make sense of how to go about your research questions and how to go about your research altogether, especially
I think,
resilience. Sorry.
yeah. I mean, I want to come back to the resilience piece, but from being an innovation scholar, like, um, I guess maybe that's I could include that as an identity, as a scholarly identity, but um, doing like inventing, doing the actions of inventing was an homage to my father, in the sense of it was a creative chase that had like also an intellectual component to it. Um, and it was the feeling that I wasn't just sitting down and doing engineering, or some kind of average engineering job. It was adding creativity to it. And so that's what kept me in engineering as long as I did it, is that it was able to kind of satisfy a bit of that creative intellectual puzzle chasing, that which I needed. But then after some time, and after accumulating patents and things like that, I was like, what do these all mean? Like, are they really worth it? Like, that one's just sitting there. That invention's not that great. I'd be like, you know, that one's just so incremental on top of that one. I'm like, it's not really interesting. And I was like, what does this all mean? And then, I was drawn to that curiosity of what does it all mean, this work life that I've engaged in, and trying to make sense of it through studying organizations and through studying entrepreneurship and things like that. Because I went to big companies all the way down to small, to consulting on my own before I left. And I was like, what does it all mean? I had this kind of empty feeling of what it all meant. And for me, like, the research questions I ask are very personal, sense of helping me try to understand what pieces of that life meant. And so it was like therapeutic maybe at times to go back and confront it through these research questions. And then when I got comfortable with the practice of scholarship, it was then more I could dream a bit more, and bring in more of my activism and passions and things like that. And so, like, for me, you know the the dance or whatever, or the delicacy of writing about Palestine and using it as an empirical setting, for instance, was so hard in the review process, based on how biased and racist so many reviewers in our community were at our top journals. And so I had expected it. I expected resistance to it. So the business and society piece that I did, like I was really inspired by working in that space with Ash Prasad, brilliant scholar, and you know, for me, like, okay, there's some interesting contributions. I don't mean to diminish the intellectual value of that work, but for me, getting that published in a good journal that gets readers and things like that was an act of activism. Um, and that's what brought me more payback than securing a publication in a certain journal, or what I was able to say about bricolage, maybe in that point. It was bringing a Palestinian story to light of that cause. And that's what really kind of motivated me in study. So it was a very personal connection. And it's so interesting. Canaan was the name of the olive oil company that we explored, that entrepreneur. And um, I just ordered some, just all his olive oil. It's available in the US now and things like that. Maybe not for long, but like he's doing well. He's out there, he's surviving. And, so there's some truth, I think, to what we uncovered of how he was going about things, how he was navigating living under occupation and apartheid, and just lack of basic human rights, lack of mobility, that he was able to do things. So those are the stories that kind of inspire me now. Those are the innovations that I think inspire me more than anything, right now. And it's that chance to give space to, characters like that in our research that matter more than anything, any more than any theory contribution I could make. And so, but knowing you have to do that, obviously, that's the game. And I'm still engaged by that, but personally motivated in my career by the storytelling opportunities.
And I think that has stayed throughout. Look at any of your piece you pick up, and then you can see that theme emerging very, very clearly, and it shows your intent in terms of carrying those stories, reaching out to people. Another of your work, which I think you just published with Doha, I believe, where you've spoken about how entrepreneurship takes shape in a very difficult context, especially when we're talking about a patriarchal setting. And you studied the role of men, their identities. And what I want to know for our audience, especially given the work you've done, is a fabulous piece. If you would be able to unpack for us your study on masculinities and how it changes the way we think about entrepreneurship, especially in conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I guess it could be put into maybe the gender bound research in the entrepreneurship world is how that's studied. And rightfully so. So much of that work is focused more on women entrepreneurs, and as has been long overdue. That's there. But we thought it was really fascinating to look at men in these deeply patriarchal worlds that exist there, and some of the conflicts that they encounter. And it connected with other projects and work that I found. Like, I think my most interesting pursuits are stuff that's not published yet, of data that I've collected, or things that are in motion and things right now. It's a lot of these same kind of themes kind of coming together. And and coming back to my original question, is entrepreneurship good for these societies that's there? And like, in the world of entrepreneurship, we tend to romanticize what entrepreneurship is and what it means to people. And we have, in the US and the Western world, we have this hubris that is this gift that we give to the developing worlds, to upgrade them to a better quality of life. And they see the spark of entrepreneurship, and like, you know Schumpeterian cannons go off, and they're suddenly on the right path of development that's there. these very romantic, like poorly understood notions of what entrepreneurship is to these places. And so it was really interesting to get into that study and like talk to these Iraqi men, these entrepreneurs who don't necessarily think of themselves as entrepreneurs, but in that society that's uncovered decades of occupation and war that they've gone through, um, it was a chance to enact masculinity. That it wasn't entrepreneurship necessarily for because they have the passion, to do an entrepreneurial pursuit that's there. It was kind of backed into a corner, and so, but it's something a little different from this necessity-based entrepreneurship. It may have began with necessity-based entrepreneurship, but what we realized is it fulfilled their need to feel like the breadwinner of their families and kind of reinstitute their roles in their families as with respect and to not feel shame and things like that because of all the social pressures and norms in their society to expect of what men should be doing at certain stages of life because all that's disrupted by war of what happens, expected age of when you get married or have kids or go through life milestones, all that gets disrupted by war. And I've seen that in so many of my data sets in places like that, around the world, is either the acceleration or of life milestones in the event that they've been hit with events like war or displacement or become refugees, or that disappointment and shame and that void of how these life milestones they feel behind in life and supporting their families and their expectations because of the deep cultural traditions that are embedded in these societies of what you should be doing when in life that's there. Now, what's interesting is entrepreneurship in this case that's like the second best option. It's not like liberating for them in that sense. Like it's not emancipation in terms of their economic livelihoods necessarily. It's enough to get by. They would much, much, much more love a government job with stability and to be in that system because you're more protected based on things like WASTA, if it's the Middle East, or other practices that can be corrupt, but you're protected by that system of being in that club. And they'd much rather have that, but because they can't, they do it through entrepreneurship. And then they find like there's the homosociality of working with other men and being with other men and feeling you have this community suddenly in being a part of that too. And that also is reinforcing of the male ego in that case. Now, the downside of all that is it perpetuates the reproducibility of the patriarchy and those norms and values in society. And so it allows men to keep being men how they want to be men. And there's a lot of repercussions for women and family and things like that that can fall out from things like that. And so it's so complex, it's so nuanced, and so you can't even quite answer that question still of is entrepreneurship good, for these people in these societies at that moment that's there. Yeah.
It has definitely shed a light on a very different kind of entrepreneurship, especially in these contexts. But then there's also a story about exclusion of women in this as well, which is nice. Really, it has come out really really well in terms of how you guys have framed it. But then, if you allow me to take you from this kind of work to a different kind of work, which you've done again, all being threaded within the same context, though where you've gone into refugee camps, in Jordan to study supply chains and how networks emerge, which again, you talk about without a functioning institution. So, what did you see there in terms of how the product of entrepreneurship, in terms of the market, how they take shape in displacement, and how It basically challenges the Western notion of traditional supply chain, or we call it as entrepreneurship, what we teach inside the classroom, inside the textbook, which is all very polished, which is all very, very nicely packaged.
Yeah. Um, that data was so fascinating to me, so rich. There's other studies that we hope to come out of it, and we're still collecting data there in the Zaatari camp, in Azraq camp in Jordan, because so much it keeps changing. The turn of events, what happens in Syria changes what life is like in these camps, and so um, that was fascinating. And I think like it was data that was so rich and so dynamic that we really had to spend what amounted to years in it, at least 3 years, where we would collect data and then we'd talk about it like every week and just have conversations about the data and the interesting and the stories and the different stakeholders that we'd interview. It was just so incredibly engaging. It was like, this is so rich. Where do we even begin in this story? And we had the aspiration to tell a story at the camp level. And that's it's just kind of an uncommon level of analysis to play in. And so that was really hard. That was a really hard thing, I think, to do. And because my co-authors were more supply chain scholars in that case, we bent it more towards a supply chain story, at least the first harvest from that data. And just the emergence of these different kinds of social capitals that mattered for different relationships to evolve this network that was there was really interesting, but it was all guided by, in part guided by external events in terms of like, for instance, there's a lot of resistance to how the UN was running the camp, like early on, and all the unmet needs that were there. And in that camp, you had people from maybe both sides of the civil conflict that were pouring into the same camp. And so the trust of one another in that camp amongst Syrian refugees was very low at that time. And so it added to kind of like the extreme tension that was there. And it was like these certain moments of like the fall of Dara to the Assad regime, which is the village or the area where most of the refugees were coming from. It was kind of like the center of the conflict at that time, was a moment where the refugees in scale basically said, okay, this is now it. We are now here. And once that was the case, they wasted no time in building infrastructure, by doing that, through using their social capitals, through using cultural capitals and things like that, with a community that was based off like historic tribal histories of different families that had traded for years, at that border of Jordan and Syria at that time. And so there was a lot of enacting of cultural capital that goes back, for hundreds of years, that was there to evoke relationships that were in place. And those relationships evolved, and they began with a lot of relief goods. Because that community that the camp was based in was extremely poor in Jordan. And so suddenly there was like all these UN characters around and NGOs and things like that were supporting the economy, and like there's a bit of money, and then there's relief goods, and that's a pretty nice tent. I could sell that to someone, a Jordanian or something like that. Um, and so we just, there's so many specific supply chains we could have focused on, everything from donkeys to caravans to bicycles and things like that evolved through the camp to relief goods. But it was just so interesting to see how the refugees were able to counter the imperfect relief efforts that were being attempted and pushed on them, and turning them into markets to turn it into a viable life, because they were trying to get to stability and to get out of a liminal place. And to do that, they needed aspects of market life. Cafes are where the socialization happened. That's where you see people. That's where you see family and your friends and things like that. And so to make a makeshift cafe or something like that inside the camp, or where you get certain foods or wedding dress rentals or things like that, they were assembling a social life that was, I guess, a simulacrum of what they experienced at home. And they had to do it through networks that depended on the informal and formal economy that's there. And so ultimately, that's kind of like a short synopsis of it. But um,
But I
through
think,
that,
sorry.
yeah, I was just gonna say, just add like through that study, from a policy level, I am a huge proponent of the informal economy, a huge proponent of it. And I think more policy making should happen around supporting informal economies with some kind of boundaries and rules. But I'm a huge advocate for it in so many cases. And that in my all my other studies that I have going on now relate to it. And so I'm excited for where those could go.
And I think given how fascinating your work is, again, for people or for researchers who are interested in this kind of work, the beauty of it is how you have managed to convert a set of data into a beautiful story. A story where, again, you talk about institutions or rather lack of them. So if we talk about UN, there's so many others as well. But you've wonderfully explained how the constraint of having an institution or not having an institution, how it creates that entrepreneurial opportunity. And again, a researcher of your caliber is able to, project that in your paper with, I believe with Jonathan Webb and Mike Hitt, right? You worked in terms of trying to showcase the role of institution. But again, if we bring that research out of that place, you mentioned about the formal economy and the informal economy as well. Um, how would it work in places like United Kingdom or United States of America where things are very, very formalized? Do you see institutional weakness acting as a barrier, or does it create a new space for refugee and migrant entrepreneurs to explore and emerge out of that?
Well, I'm no expert on these other contexts like the UK or things like that to maybe speak to it. Um, I think like the value of the informal economy in other contexts around the world is well, it's very context dependent of what value it can bring. But I think that it is can be this incredible proving ground to build confidence in, maybe enterprise capabilities that may allow them to eventually like enter formal economies and things like that, or to formalize their business as they cross different thresholds of growth and things like that that's there. And so I think it's we talk so much about formal schooling and the importance of formal education and things like that, but it's a form of informal education that is can be so much more rich in terms of providing experience and confidence and know-how and capabilities to build an economic livelihood that's there. And when we look at the levels of either corruption or that open door, revolving door between big companies and big industry and government that's there to make ensure that multinational interests are first priority of governments that's there. When I look at like we were talking earlier, that the mask is off in terms of corruption, in terms of relationships between our governments and multinationals or their own specific interests, the government official, their interests. Like um, I'm all for the grassroots informal economy to take care of yourself in terms of these economic livelihoods, because you can't count on institutional infrastructure in so many places to support you in that way. And I know like there's a situation, well, what about the tax base and things like that? When you see how little a Jeff Bezos or an Amazon or something pays in taxes that's there. Like, I think that argument's dead on arrival that the multinationals aren't paying taxes or their founders and things like that. Then, what standard does that set that's there? I've got a, a project I'm most excited about right now, and I want to plug the lead on it, Hodar Bedi, and he's a PhD student at Bay School of Business. He's going on the job market for anyone listening. He's doing incredible work, and he is from Beirut, and he and I have this project starting in the informal currency trade that's happening there. And it's a function of the economic devastation of Lebanon, and what they've gone through over a long history, but particularly the past, I would say, 7-8 years. And it's led to this really bustling informal currency trade operation that's there. And I won't spoil all the interesting like work that's going to come out of that, but like it's it's fascinating that the pull, because I'm really fascinated by what is that pull into the informal economy. Why would someone leave a formal trajectory, whether they haven't started it yet, but they've been conditioned that this is the life you need to live, or they've been on it and they've been underwhelmed by it or can't make ends meet or things like that, and look at what begins as a side hustle maybe or something like that, but then begins to be their career. That's it. We don't know about that slip into informality. And that's
Mhm.
what this study gets at, is that slip of how that transition happens. And in that case, we find that there is a slip into informality that's there. And a big reason around that is a lot of like status maintenance in society and things like that, and who you are. And it's a more lucrative means and more bankable and dependable means to keep you on track with life milestones, as we were talking about there culturally. And but it's been such a proving ground for a new skill that you see them now transition back into like crypto, and now they become formal crypto traders after that, because they become very skilled in that capability of currency training and making sense of dynamic value of currency that's there. And so it's just really fascinating. And like it's not a master's program, it's not going back to school, it's not a certificate or a micro credential. It's going to the informal economy to learn how certain things are done, and then taking those skills and coming out of it, because you can't count on your government or other institutional infrastructures to support you in this way. So I'm just really fascinated by that. It's very, to answer your original question way back, is it's very context dependent of how that matters. I wish countries would relax on refugees and things like that are being brought in, to allow them to skill build in ways, if they're not providing social services for them, to try and get there, as long as it's keeping it legitimate, the kind of entrepreneurship that it is.
But it looks like no one's listening to you and me that way. But in terms of
Yeah.
what you mentioned, it's actually a fascinating story in times like these, because when you talk about the formal economy or a formal system, that equates to credibility and legitimacy. Now, what you just described, this is just the other way around in terms of how would you find that credibility and legitimacy if you're not operating in a formal economy or a formal environment. So what signal does it actually give when it comes to a fragile ecosystem, especially low and middle income countries? When you have a performance like this, or when you have an outbreak like this, given your long history of understanding how entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial journey unfolds?
Help me understand that question again,
So,
Tabish.
the fragile ecosystem which your work is mostly situated in, if you have individuals, if you have innovators who are looking to break out of that formal ecosystem and then pave their way into the informal ecosystem, and then trying to do that, what sort of signal does it send to the world or to the environment within which they would like to operate?
I think the clear signal is, I think, the failure of institutions as they're understood today, as we've been led to believe that they should function. That's there. Um, and I think there's many places around the world where there's a don't ask, don't tell understanding between governments and the informal economy of, well, it keeps the country running. These informal economies keep things running at some level, and there are probably not that many degrees of separation between like a government official and someone that they know that has some connection to the informal economy in a lot of places around the world. And so I think, you know, when we talk about what we began this with of the mask is off, in so many places that the more the mask comes off of what our governments are up to or what they're not up to in terms of supporting their people, the more you feel, you know, a social license to embark on life, through your own agency to kind of take it into your own hands. That's there if the opportunity's there. And so that's I think I think we're a long ways off between understanding what that is. I'd be curious. I haven't looked at like what the ILO has explored in terms of informal economy in some time. That's there, but I know they did a lot of exploration around like apprenticeships and things like that, which are like unpaid work in many parts around the world, and in like what those mean. But like you have these kind of surrogates for apprenticeship and getting that can happen in the informal economy that shouldn't be disregarded because a lot of times they often end up back in the formal economy, and that was the route that they took to get there. And so I think government should be happy about that, is that they end up in a place that's contributing to the tax wealth of the country and things like that. But the mask is off, and so I think a lot of people are faced with that question of, now what am I going to do, now that it's off, now that I know.
It gives us all an opportunity to really refresh or review the whole process in terms of how this transformation happens and look beyond your own immediate environment, especially for us likes of ourselves working in United Kingdom or USA or in the Western economy. But if you don't mind shifting a bit in terms of your work beyond academia, you worked with organizations like European Commission, UNIDO. There's so many NGOs. You work in North Africa and Middle East. Someone told me really that as academics, and again, you might not agree with it, but we should not be we should not be policymakers, or we should not at least attempt to be policymakers, because our role purely is to do that research and give it out to them. Yes, we can do the recommendation, we can provide the recommendation, but it's not our place to tell them what policies to make. But when we talk about supporting entrepreneurship in fragile setting, some of your work has really um, gone there and has
Hmm.
really provided a real solid recommendation in terms of these are the things which we should be doing. Now, where do you see entrepreneurship going forward in terms of that policy making space based on everything you've done?
Yeah, I'm really cautious about that policy expectation for the work we do, and um, I've been in that position a few times, whether it's working with NGOs or in one case, I led a technical mission to Palestine from a European Commission funded organization that was trying to bring more of the Mediterranean universities into the Erasmus Plus program and things like that. In the case of Palestine, the technical assistance mission was to, um, work with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labor in Palestine, speak to the universities on how they incorporate more entrepreneurship into their curriculums to solve massive, like 60% unemployment problems for new graduates based on living under apartheid and occupation from Israel in that case. And so it was like, first of all, there's like, you know, getting your head around the fact of, you're a part of the piece that's trying to repair the repercussions of apartheid in that case, of living under apartheid. And so instead of fixing this, the root of the problem is undoing apartheid in Palestine and living under apartheid and instilling human rights and recognizing Palestinian dignity. You're part of this band-aid or repair program to kind of support it. And I took the mission and I went there, and I went there as humble as I could. And so I think that's really important as scholars, is we need to approach policy with complete humility and appreciation for, we may not totally understand on the ground what's really going on that's there. And there's a long history of that conversation, I think, between academics and bureaucrats in governments and things like that. And it's just our elite bond that we have between those two stakeholders, but really understanding what's on the ground. So in this case, being Palestinian, I knew very well what was happening on the ground in those places. And I knew what was happening inside these universities as far as like how many classes they have to teach, how many hats they have to wear, how little they are paid, how no time they have for research and things like that. And so to come in, and say, I've got it all figured out. Here you go. Here's how you need to change things. And it's coming from, this kind of Western orientation of what an entrepreneurship curriculum would look like in a school that's uncontextualized in a lot of cases. It was something that like I completely just threw away and came in there with humility about doing surgery within the system that they have to live under. So doing curriculum surgery to say, let's see what you have, let's see what's working, and see how we can do things maybe at the assignment level and not throw out these things that you have no time to really do justice to or resources to do justice to. And so, yeah, I think you have to come in humble and with humility and an appreciation, and don't bother going or showing up or having those conversations if you don't understand what life is like on the ground in these places. And for me, like the publication that really kind of stood out to me was the one with Yulia Shimko, where we looked at the incubator in Ecuador, where it was like a lot of incubators around the world. And I've seen many that just trouble me and, keep me really wondering about that question, is entrepreneurship good? But in this case, like it was a lot of Silicon Valley, like high performance entrepreneurship models that were pushed in Quito, in Ecuador, on this community. And you had those that showed up and they had traveled maybe a bit around the world. They had come from maybe a bit more means, and they were rooted in more of a world community. And they're like, yes, I get this. I can understand. I can picture Silicon Valley life, and I get this, and I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to come up with the next app that has a twist. And then there were those that were more indigenous and rooted more within their own communities, seeing the social problems and the development problems every day that were there, and coming to it. And they would look at it and be like, you don't understand us at all, because it was so context deaf of pushing these things. And so the irony is they would become social entrepreneurs of some sort, mostly in the area of social work, doing social work with entrepreneurial spirit. But they did it in harsh reaction to these models that were being impressed on them, of like, we want no part of these models. We want no part of following, Zuckerberg's playbook or something like that. We're going to do it our way because you don't understand us. And so it was like a different kind of impetus to act entrepreneurially towards actions of social work to support their community, because they were so poorly understood by the models being presented to them. And the saddest maybe ones were those that worshipped, were never got out, never traveled, never did those things, and they worshipped the Tom shoes and the social entrepreneurship, standouts that they had heard about, but kept trying to bridge their world towards that, and not recognizing how that those models don't necessarily apply to those contexts. And so for me, that was like a very clarifying study for me, and understanding the nuance and complexity of, is entrepreneurship good to these places? And wholly, you could say yes, but it depends. And let's talk about context before we ask that question again somewhere else. That's there. Yeah.
So sometimes you wonder, a lot of the international development agencies, and again, you have the experience of working with them, they get this wrong about people, about entrepreneurship, especially in these contexts. And of course, through your work, you've shown us that how poles apart, how far apart we are in terms of what they're actually looking to achieve, and what these international agencies who come with a lot of funding they want them to achieve. There's a very imposing model out there. So, what I want to do now is, in terms of your own research, which, like you've demonstrated very clearly, it's not theoretical at all. There are real lessons for both entrepreneurship on the ground and the enablers, as we call them. So, for if we talk specifically about refugee and necessary entrepreneurs or enablers who are listening to this episode, what insight from your research, in a sense, that you really take away and tell them, okay, this is how you navigate the environment where there's absolutely zero formal support? It just doesn't exist. So, what is that one piece of advice would you give to them?
To the entrepreneurs on the ground in those places,
Yes.
I think, as I was saying before, I think to um, throw out these models that get thrown at them, and to really try to understand their context in a deep way, and to not be cluttered, I think, by these neoliberal models that get like pushed on them of how things need to work, and to um I think try to understand the boundaries of agency that are real in a lot of these societies. And there's not always a romantic happy ending to entrepreneurship in these places, and it's because of the boundaries to agency that exists in a lot of these cases. And you know to be able to take that objective look at you within those societies and what you're capable of doing, I think is kind of the first step. That's there. um I did I did, I guess, kind of ask that question in work I did in Marrakesh. And in that case, like, there's so much, as we talked about, there's so much neoliberal push of, this is what you need for development. This is what you need. You need an incubator. You got it. And then the ecosystem will just evolve from there. And, I'd visit the empty incubator connected to the University of Marrakesh. And I'd be like, okay, what are the ideas that people have? I'm just curious, like, what are their ideas? And we did a pitch fest, and anyone could pitch. Like, it was like one of the largest public like engineering schools that was there. And so I was very curious, like, what would they pitch if they could pitch something? And the outcomes were fascinating. That's there, and I think they tracked pretty well with like what we found in Quito is like, those that had a little bit of experience, they had left the city. They had left maybe the country, perhaps, in rare occasions. And they fell on script for what you would say at a pitch fest anywhere around the world, as far as what they're saying. And there wasn't substance in the ideas necessarily. The ideas didn't make sense. But the lingo and the vocabulary that they had, they were trying to emulate these romantic notions of what a pitch looks like in these worlds. And it was as sad as it was beautiful, as it was humorous, as it was interesting. It was really just kind of, but troubling, I think, at the end of the day, because I had a good sense of what the boundaries of what some of these individuals were up against in their personal lives and in society there. And, if they really wanted to do those things they were pitching, the feasibility was really hard, of what they wanted to do. And so I just hope they don't have these these dreams that they're passionate about that they'll never realize and have sadness and depression about what can never be. At the same time, there's sadness and very broad, big social problems. Addressing those were pitched that were there, and those were most interesting to me because they look at entrepreneurship as a way to solve their social malaise, and whether it be health related or whether it be environmental related or human rights related. There was like an opportunity to think about entrepreneurship as a way to kind of solve those problems. And the ideas were always a little bit lacking, but the passion to solve those problems and their care for society was so deep in community that they had there. Yeah. And then the third ideas that we saw there was just this highly nationalistic view. And so it wasn't necessarily, and this came mostly from men that were there, but this view of like, we're going to make heavy machinery now, like in our country. We have no like industrial base to make heavy machinery, but that's what we want to do. We're going to stop importing. And so it was all about doing it all within that was there. And when you unpack that, you could unpack it, I guess, a lot of different ways, but it was this, perhaps like wounded male ego that's there of like seeing the dependency of the country on, outsiders that was there and feeling like you want that, within that was there. It was very nationalistic and, there are like these amazing orations, speeches given of what we need to have a tea industry and Morocco. Why are we importing our tea? Tea is in our culture and like, the shame aspects of like, this is our culture. We need to do this. And it was fascinating stuff, to see, but it was sad in the sense of that wasn't entrepreneurship necessarily that was going to save any of these individuals that was there. And at the end of the day, any one of them would have taken a stable government job if it was given to them, or something in the main, like mining industries or things like that, that were dependable or things that they could be connected to the king's interests, So,
Anyway,
yeah,
it does dive into a bit of identity as well when you talk about, the stories such as these where they want to be what they want to be, but without, in terms of understanding their own context. And in the third example which you gave, obviously, is coming from what they see around them. And, obviously, you're seeing that right now happening to this part of the world as well, where the youngsters are obviously led by the big mob. They want to do things very, very nationalistic. But again, it's an interesting take on what you just mentioned. But given our discussion, Ted, I want to move on because I'm very conscious of your time as well.
sure.
If you've looked at the past, we've looked at the present in terms of some of the things which you have mentioned. Shall we move towards the future? And again, just a couple of sections, and then we'll close off the whole discussion. But we all know how fragile the situation is as of now. We're talking about climate change, so obviously the forced migration, there is instability in terms of the politics. They're all shaping entrepreneurship, which is yours and mine discipline. So, how do you actually see a very survival driven entrepreneurship? How do you think it's going to evolve over the next few decades? Again, I know you and me don't have a crystal ball, but you've got wealth of experience. You've seen so many other contexts. But how do you see it evolving over the next 5 or 10 years, if I may ask?
I still believe the power of the informal economy is going to really shape entrepreneurial dynamics in many places, around the world. In some cases, out of desperation, in complete necessity, that's there, lack of trust or capability from governments in terms of serving its people. Inaction, yeah, from governments and things like that is going to, I think, prompt a lot more thinking of life as temporary, life is short, life is fragile. Um, and I'm obligated to my family. I'm obligated to, others. And so I need to take matters into my own hands and pursue it by any means necessary. And so I do see a great deal of that. And I'm not so oh, I'm not so naive as to assume it's all going to be good and productive forms of entrepreneurship in the informal economy, because acts of desperation can lead to a lot of different situations of enterprise pursuit. Um, but it's only going to happen more and more. And I think you're going to see that happening more and more in terms of, like, you know, the Western world as well, too. As we see these, like, levels of authoritarianism or autocracy can happen at the policy level, it can happen at the state level, municipality level. There's so many levels that it can happen. We're seeing it obviously happen in the US in so many instances just daily. That's happening there. We're seeing levels of authoritarianism, if we consider that a continuum, happening on a lot of different levels and sometimes at scale that's there. And so I think the more boundaries that you see get put on these societies that are quote unquote liberal thinking and been free and things like that, I think there's going to be like a values clash that you're going to see here. And if the political options are dwindling to counter it, to get the right administrations and people in power to support it, I think we need to pay more attention to what we've learned from the social movements literature, what we've learned from maybe some institutional work literature and things like that, to really trying to understand of, like, how do we move forward under oppressive regimes that's in place? Like, what do we do when there's oppressive regimes in place? And I think there's going to be, I think, this opportunities for some really fascinating work, because we have right now we've got incredible empirical opportunities to study that, but we need so much more to do on the theory side as far as trying to understand of ways forward, that we act process-based research, temporalities considered of how we move forward in these dynamic new normal of easing into authoritarianism that's happening in so many places around the world, the lean into fascism that we're finding everywhere. And coming back to our original thought, this is where it's all connected to Palestine, and that we have this kind of live case of you can do whatever you want and there's no consequences that's happening there, in terms of you know how abusive you could be. And that's what there's a lot of people learning from Israel's playbook, I think, right now, as far as administrations of what you can get away with and how international law doesn't apply, in those situations.
And this is where I feel that we as a community have failed in terms of looking at the current theories and models, um, how they are. I don't know how they are equipped to handle what is going to come and what institutions are doing. So the question remains: do we continue holding on to that, or do we actually come up with entirely new framework, both in terms of what we teach, what we study, what we research, and what we apply in the society overall?
I think we definitely, as educators, we definitely need to hold space for digesting what is happening at the first level and trying to understand how to deal in that world for our students. And I think that's really important. And it's funny, last spring, I was on sabbatical last year, but a year ago spring, like, I was teaching and attempted to hold space for conversations around Palestine. There's a encampment on our campus and things like that, and I was like, let's talk about this. Let's try and hold space for it. Let's try and talk about like what's prompted this. In that case, it was like the fact that we were had a relationship with Boeing, and so the students were protesting the university's relationship with Boeing at that time, which is, responsible for about 80% of the bombs that have been dropped on Palestine. The six Hiroshima's worth of bombs that have been dropped on Gaza, and I was surprised how taken aback the students were by making space for where are we at. Let's just stop what we had planned for today, stop what we had to do for our class projects and things like that, our capstone, and let's just talk about where we're at. Let's talk about what's happening on campus right now, and let's unpack that to the world level of what's led to this moment. And how do we make sense of that? And I think the more we can encourage our students to be system thinkers out there as is really critical. That's there. And that what we chalk up is all this began on a certain date according to the media or whatever the situation is around the world, and not trying to understand history and the trend towards reductionism of our news and just focusing on headlines and low attention spans and things like that. I think now more than ever we need more systems thinking in business, in all schools, but particularly in business schools, to make sure that like our students aren't on the other side of those negotiating tables trying to sell weaponry to countries like Israel or other rogue nations around the world.
Or play a part in what technology is doing in terms of playing into the hands of these regimes and these
AI,
individual
right?
leaders. Yes,
That's
I didn't want to mention as such, but
yeah.
again, some of the discussion I've had previously and having studied digital transformation for this long, you kind of feel that there's a due from the previous cycle, which was promised a great deal, which was sold on a big altar, but it never materialized. And then we are all running towards a new form of technology, which is doing nothing but doing exactly the same thing in terms of creating that divide, those who've got access. If you talk about AI, again, 30 to 35% of the population in the world, they don't have access to internet. So what's happening to that before you talk about AI? So there are so many conversations out there, but again, we need scholars like you, Ted, in terms of really offering those new frameworks in terms of understanding where we are as far as entrepreneurship is concerned, because I strongly believe it's a transformation is for good. But then for that to materialize, for that to happen, you need to look at it from a new perspective, new theory, and new framework, because some of it which is out there is not functioning and it's not working at all for any one of us in the society, whether that's our colleagues, our researchers, or students at all.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tabish. Yeah.
Thank you. So now this is the last section, Ted, which brings us to what I refer to as quick fire round. I'll have three quick fire questions and very simple ones, straightforward.
Okay.
So the first one coming your way. Promise not to push you in the corner at all. So one paper of yours, which you wish every policymakers, I know the argument we had previously, but in terms of one paper you'd want to hand it over to a policymaker, you want them to read, what would that be?
Um, I think probably my theory piece in ETMP about informal institutions. I struggle with some of the concepts in there, um, that like I think could be refined, but I think an appreciation for the informal institutions and the power of informal institutions and shaping societies is should be
Okay.
is definitely up there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. My next
Yeah.
question to you would take you in your memory lanes in terms of thinking about a refugee entrepreneur. Again, I hate that word, but in terms of the work you have done, any particular individual which really has inspired you or has really pushed you to think about all this in a very different way?
Yeah, I think, well, as far as refugee entrepreneurs, that would have to come from only the work that I've done, like in the camps in Jordan. That's there, but I think I think that appreciation for the quest to get out of liminality and entrepreneurship as a means to get out of places of liminality, whether it's a refugee that situation that marks liminality or other life circumstances that's there. I think that stands out the most to me, and all the voices I think of those that we collected interviews from and in the Jordan's camps were really stand out. Yeah,
Okay, okay, thank you. And my last question, which we
yeah.
would want to end on a positive note, which is why I'm asking you this. Um, is there a thing which gives you hope about, especially entrepreneurship in a fragile context? That could be anywhere. That could be in Palestine. That could be in Sudan or anywhere else which we are seeing at the moment. Anything which gives you hope when practicing or thinking about entrepreneurship?
I don't know. I guess I'm always encouraged by the informal economy and openness to the informal economy as a way forward. That's there, and so seeing like stigma, I think removed around the informal economy is it gives me some hope, and that can happen at the formal level with with governments, which is kind of like a hard sell, but seeing like families being more okay with, oh, okay, my child is going to be an informal entrepreneur, and this is happening there, and not finding shame around it and being okay with it, and seeing that like there's a perfectly acceptable economic livelihood sometimes that can come from it, and I think that kind of is encouraging to see, because when it creeps into kind of the social fabric of culture and things like that, where there's like, yeah, life is short, and like, yes, this needs to happen this way, even though it's not what we had in mind. I think that removing some of that stigma from pursuing the informal economy is really kind of interesting. I know it's a controversial thing to say, to be such a cheerleader for the informal economy. I know there's a lot of downsides and darkness that exist there too, and I don't want to disregard what those are, but I think there's some safe routes forward with that.
I wish we had more time to talk about that because it was fascinating. Ted, thank you so much. It was really an eye opening conversation. One thing I will say in terms of what your work does, it shines light on so many different aspects of entrepreneurship, but in terms of your institution and your power, and how you have shown your resilience. Most of your work shows the survival instinct in terms of how you're able to shine light on dignity, especially for people who are working in very, very difficult conditions. So, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you taking out the time. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. So, I'll appeal to you, if this conversation at all spoke to you, please make sure you follow and share. And please rate the podcast so that I can bring you more voices like that. And thank you so much.